Good morning. This conference explores the theme of how the promotion of good governance is fundamental to the drive to end poverty and drive growth in the Caribbean. It cuts directly to how good governance results from successfully curbing corruption, money laundering, and cybercrime. The title of this keynote, however, or this keynote discussion, I should say, is Promoting Good Governance in Uncertain Times by Curbing Corruption. So it focuses on the corruption aspect of the theme of the conference. It highlights lessons for the Caribbean, from policymakers to students in the audience. Hopefully each one of you will be able to have some solid takeaways. All three of the discussants on this keynote discussion lead integrity offices in international financial institutions, specifically multilateral development banks that serve the Caribbean, that have a footprint in the region. Mouhammadou Diagne is the Vice President of Integrity of the World Bank's office known as INT. You will hear a lot from Mouhammadou, as well as Laura Profeta, who's the Chief of the Office of Institutional Integrity, known as OII at the Inter-American Development Bank. I'm the head of the Office of Integrity, Compliance, and Accountability here at the Caribbean Development Bank. And colleagues, where I would like to start is with the point that ending poverty, driving growth in the Caribbean is no easy task, particularly when we have to deal with multiple crises. Crises compound and complicate everything. Each year, the region has to navigate through multiple crises, yet it feels each time as if each of those crises creep up on us and they deliver untold and lasting damage. But often during the heat of each crisis, we forget the things that allow us to keep our heads. We forget the need to do things that will enable us to transition our way through what I call the 4 stages of moving to achieve stability, to achieve recovery, to return to growth, and then achieve sustainable, resilient development. At each of those phases and along that entire continuum, governance is fundamentally important. Those transitions and how we identify them and handle them in uncertain times will determine how quickly we're able to pick ourselves up to run again. And during those, or each of these crises, we have opportunities like these to sit and have very constructive discourse, to share our views about how to promote good governance while navigating through uncertain times and perhaps into a new normal. But first, to begin this keynote discussion, what I'd like us to do is outline the status quo. By uncertain times, we're referring to the pandemic and its broad impacts caused by COVID-19 and its variants, most notably Omicron. And I'd like to start with Mouhammadou. Mouhammadou, what has been the World Bank's response to date in relation to the uncertain times caused by COVID-19?
Well, thanks, Toussant. And first of all, thanks again for the opportunity to join you and Laura for this discussion at the 3C conference this year. It's always a pleasure. I think when we talk about uncertainty, it's clear that front and center of our thinking is the pandemic and the health aspect of the crisis. I don't think we need to elaborate much further. Everyone has experienced it over the past year and a half. But I think beyond the health crisis itself, also there are other dimensions of uncertainty, certainly on the economic front, because as the pandemic lasts longer, it's clear that we are facing higher risks for significant economic impact and even potentially a global recession. There is a lot of uncertainty on that front as well. Likewise, I think on the social front, the combined impact of the pandemic and its economic corollaries, if you will, have had significant social ramifications in terms of poverty, in terms of inequalities, the widening gaps in areas such as education, gender equality, etc. So I think all of these areas, there are some potentially long-lasting impacts that do cause a significant amount of vulnerabilities, of uncertainties going forward. In terms of the bank's response, it's been quite a massive response, I would say. And just going back to the pandemic for a second and the efforts to stem it, and clearly that has been priority number one for our institution, and I'm assuming for all of our institutions represented on this panel. The response has been quite significant on the part of the World Bank. For example, since April of last year, between April of last year and the end of this fiscal year, which was for us June of 2021. So between April 20 and June 21, we have actually committed $157 billion to help our clients deal with the crisis. It's a massive scale of spending. And this has covered a number of aspects, whether it's helping our clients with health supplies and equipment, particularly at the inception of the pandemic, but also helping them with strengthening their health systems, providing social protection support in some cases, support to businesses as well to keep them running even during the pandemic, and increasingly in the more recent past, access to vaccines, particularly for poorest countries. So I think in all of these areas, the World Bank's response has been quite significant.
Thank you. And you, Laura, how has it been for the Inter-American Development Bank?
I promised to answer that question, but first I would like to thank you, Toussant, for having me here to discuss a topic that is absolutely central to the success of all countries and to the IDB Group's development work. And thank you, Mouhammadou, for sharing the stage, and thank you to the audience for joining us early in the morning. For those of you who are in the audience who don't know about the institutional framework of the IDB Group, I'll take just a minute to mention that and give you a brief introduction. OII, the Office of Institutional Integrity, has a central role in the IDB Group's commitment to integrity through its mandate to, first of all, prevent integrity risk and to support the operational units. Secondly, to conduct investigations of what we call prohibited practices. So that's what we cover. And getting back to your question, Toussant, in 2020, the IDB Group approved a record-setting $21.6 billion in new loan approvals, reformulation of existing projects, and mobilization of resources, much of which went to the COVID-19 response, and that is just for the Latin American and Caribbean region. And those are historical levels of resources, covering, as the World Bank has just explained, a wide range of needs, including immediate public health response, support to vulnerable populations, productive sectors and employment, public policy and fiscal management. And in this context of supporting the countries overcoming the effects of the pandemic, the IDB Group also stepped up its anti-corruption efforts. I'm proud to say that this year we celebrated our 20-year anniversary of the original approval of our anti-corruption framework, but obviously today the topic could not be more relevant. It's relevant because of the pandemic, but also I think as you were relating to Toussant, because of the other situations of uncertainty we're increasingly facing, such as natural disasters, climate change, economic and financial emergencies. So if we have the chance in this discussion between us, I think we can step beyond the pandemic as well. And I'll be interested to hear both of your thoughts about these other issues and how we face these types of situations from a standpoint of safeguarding integrity. But thank you again for letting me participate in this conference.
Thank you, Laura. And that's a really good point. As we go through, we'll be mindful of the need to even stretch how we view uncertain times. Because in the context of the Caribbean, we lurch, I would say sometimes it appears from multiple crises to multiple crises. And by that, I mean a convergence of COVID-19, natural disasters happened recently with respect to the volcano the eruption in St. Vincent, together with Barbados, for instance, experiencing its first hurricane in 65 years, all happened at the same time. And beneath that is the ever-present, the perennial economic challenge that has lasted since the global financial crisis, that countries that are tourism dependent are still struggling to be able to emerge from. And I think as we go through, we'll be mindful as well to ensure that the lessons that we provide in this keynote discussion are able to be lessons that carry across. Because I think you're quite right about the fact that, how we do and promote integrity and good governance is applicable across all of those situations, being able to build back better with integrity, etc. In our case, on the specific point of COVID response, we have done just under 300 million in response, that emergency funding response directed solely to the Caribbean. It's been in a diverse number of areas like public health, education. For instance, we provided grant funding to university students, disadvantaged university students who were displaced or otherwise affected by pandemic restrictions and limitations, travel, etc. We also provided PPE funding to countries, psychosocial support, as well as what was most interesting, we also provided support for cultural and creative industries that were impacted by loss of income as a result of COVID-19, the long shutdowns, etc. In being able to deliver that level of funding, we had naturally to collaborate with a number of global and regional bodies. And I'm fortunate and very happy to say that we've been able to see the results of that, the fruits of that already manifesting. But where I'd like us to think about next and talk about next is how the deployment of those resources, particularly the rapid deployment of those resources. Mouhammadou in our pre-discussion described this as a perfect storm for potential fraud and corruption. And I'd like it if you can expand a little bit on that, and we can talk a little bit about how the need for rapid deployment and the risks related to rapid deployment can create that perfect storm.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think there's no doubt there's a clear consensus on the part of everyone involved that it was absolutely imperative, I think, that the response to COVID-19, in terms of both its size, its scope, and its speed, that the response needed absolutely to be commensurate with the unprecedented magnitude of the crisis. I don't think there's any doubt about it. We have to be fast and we have to be decisive and respond massively. That's what our stakeholders expected, and that's also, quite frankly, what the communities we serve deserve to deal with the pandemic. So this has been the plea, the urgent plea to the World Bank and to all international institutions, to bilateral donors and to individual governments. Therefore, I think in response to that, you have seen effectively a massive spending, and we've just talked about what our institutions are doing. And let's not forget, we're not the only game in town. There is also a lot that's been done by individual countries, their governments, bilateral donors. So it's quite been a significant scale of spending. Now, when you have that kind of massive spending, and in most cases, we've seen that it had to be dispersed quite fast in order to respond to the immediate needs. And the third element is, in many countries, as you know, there have been exceptional emergency measures at the country level, including in some cases quite significant reductions in various oversight and safeguard mechanisms that used to be in place in normal times. So I think the combination of these factors, massive spending, fast-track spending, exceptional emergency measures resulting in reduced safeguards, when you put all this together, that's why I refer to it as a perfect storm for potential fraud and corruption. And I think we have to be mindful of it, even though the risks may not have fully materialized in many cases yet, but we need to be mindful of it. And I think the risks are, we all know what those risks are in the context of the pandemic, whether it's around procurement fraud, bribes and kickbacks, potential embezzlement of funds, which is quite possible, even counterfeit products with potentially deadly consequences, which is often an issue in the health sector and emergency operations in the health sector. Not to mention, actually, the petty corruption in the enforcement of measures and the like, which does erode public trust and actually undermine the implementation of the response mechanism. So I think all of these things can have a significant impact in terms of the effectiveness of the response. And that's why I think that in order for the response to be effective, it is absolutely crucial that we think proactively about risk mitigation.
Absolutely. And how about you, Laura? What are your views on that point?
I couldn't agree more with everything that Mouhammadou just said. This perfect storm, as we call it, is absolutely a situation that we need to be alert to and to guard against. What we've seen during the pandemic and other experiences responding to emergency situations, such as natural disasters that we were just referring to, is that the occurrence of integrity risk is more frequent and often has a more damaging impact. Under normal circumstances, procuring agencies, of course, should opt for competitive methods. However, the situation changes in an emergency or health crisis where a very quick response is needed and the volume of resources increases significantly. And to add to the examples that Mouhammadou was giving, where integrity risks arise, because of this combination of factors, you can see, for example, different actors who are exerting pressure to influence decisions, for example, as to what to buy in exchange for bribes, or because they have unresolved conflicts of interest. Also, the availability of abundant financial resources during emergencies increases the risks because, unfortunately, it can attract unqualified contractors and providers who are looking for a quick financial gain. And this increases the risk of prohibited practices such as fraud or misappropriation. A final example would be in the private sector, which is also facing increased corruption risks during the pandemic. We can't forget the private sector. These risks include requests for quote unquote donations to speed up administrative processes that are delayed because there's fewer staff or the regular administrative procedures are not being applied. There are risks of falsification of documents to meet the requirements for the relief assistance. And there is, for example, increased money laundering risks that are faced primarily by financial institutions. So I think, these are all things we need to be mindful of. I'm interested in hearing, Toussant, what you're seeing specifically in the Caribbean area, but I think these are definitely perfect storm elements that we need to guard against.
Yeah, we're seeing a number of things, I would say, but most of it at this stage is relatively muted. One of the things that gave me the greatest joy, I believe, and we can talk about this more later in a more broader context. Over the last few days in Guyana, for instance, there was a policeman who refused a bribe for 700,000 Guyana dollars, and the two persons who offered him the bribe, 2 or 3 persons, they were charged and placed before the court. That's a rare occurrence, but that is the kind of situation that if you multiply it in the context of uncertain times and COVID-19, all the things that you both described, you can imagine what happens below the surface. This is just one case that came up. It had nothing to do with COVID-19, but it's a really great example of what is the scope of the storm underneath, the things that we don't see, the iceberg effect, so to speak. But in our case, that was private funds. But in our case, and particularly where, given the massive scale of deployment that Mouhammadou explained, not only by our institutions, but also by other players, the other players in town, is the fact that those are public funds. And public integrity is fundamental to any resilient crisis response. Those crises don't resolve themselves. They require us to be able to have rapid deployment with integrity. Having the need for rapid deployment doesn't mean that it shouldn't be done if we can find a way to do it with integrity. So I think in that context, that brings the greater understanding and obligation, so to speak, about the need to be able to walk fast, but also walk carefully, or the old American idiom that's sports related about being able to walk and chew gum. You have to be able to walk and chew gum. And even though in the context is used to describe in a derogatory way someone as not being able to do that, in the region we have had to be able to do that, and we continue to have to be able to do that, because we have to be able to walk fast, not simply to keep the receipts, but also to make sure that the whole system of accountability for those receipts, the audit systems, etc., promote the type of integrity that you want around the rapid deployment of those funds. So I completely agree that finding the right balance, particularly those of us who focus a lot on integrity in public systems and public integrity, would be keyed in to see how that is being done. The other thing is that given the history of crisis in the region, institutions like ours have developed mechanisms and instruments and tools and experience of being able to effect rapid response with integrity. It's whether, as Mouhammadou indicated quite rightly, the degree of relaxation of those controls, the dismantling, the defanging, the denuding of systems and controls intended to ensure integrity were done to the extent where it allows the opportunity for increased risks of fraud of all kinds and corruption of all kinds and at all levels. So I do think that is a careful consideration. What is important for us as well, I think, is understanding that this happens in 3 or 4 main areas. I'm thinking about, and this is something we'll come to during this discussion as well. broadly public procurement, which each of our institutions is heavily involved in. The economic stimulus packages provided by national governments and how they use those funds and how they secure and provide oversight and accountability for those funds. And then institutional integrity in individual public institutions, which I know is something I would like us to talk about, because nothing works unless institutions that are established at the national level, regional level, work and are able to promote that level of integrity. So I think to the extent that they are brushed by that perfect storm, then obviously the entire system is undermined. But to the extent that they're not, it means at least we have robust opportunities to sort of fall back on. And there are many lessons in terms of, if you look at some of the lessons as well, if I may go as far as to say, in terms of what can be used to counter that storm, there are a number of individual things, including that countries and institutions can take. Risk assessments, for instance, risk assessments and using technology and being able to monitor cyber risks, etc. All of those things help to ensure that that perfect storm, doesn't materialize. Now, another point I'd like us to go to is this idea of how do we proactively mitigate risks, and how do we also look at ensuring that, as Mouhammadou described it to us earlier, this idea of quality deployment in the context of quantity, how do we ensure that as far as possible, the governance systems are not undermined? I'd like to hear your thoughts on those two, please.
Should I jump in? Or I can jump in. Okay, I think you have hit on the key issue, Toussant. Proactive risk mitigation, the importance of prevention and risk mitigation is the greatest lesson learned from the pandemic, in my view, and other emergencies and in certain situations that we have seen. So I would definitely emphasize that as a general point. On specific measures, among the best practices we have been recommending, I would like to highlight just a few examples. For countries, data-driven approaches to analyze prices and markets of goods related to the emergency response, opening of contracting opportunities, developing appropriate inspection protocols and traceability mechanisms, and communicating proactively with the general public about the response efforts. Transparency and access to information is absolutely key. And for companies, we're recommending adjusting their compliance programs by updating the relevant policies and procedures to take account of COVID-19 requirements, undertaking additional monitoring and auditing activities, and updating risk assessments to evaluate new risks and to review priorities. And a shout out to the companies to please not under-resource your compliance programs in times of emergency. Just the opposite should be done. On all of these issues, we're very closely coordinating with our counterpart integrity and compliance offices, such as yourselves, to make sure that we are benchmarking on best practices and coordinating approaches. And I think that this joint collaboration with other institutions and with the entire integrity network in the countries and amongst our clients and member countries is extremely important. So I hope that you all can also address what you think of the importance of collaboration during emergency situations to be proactive.
Absolutely. And while you're at it too, Mouhammadou, if you can touch on in responding in that context, specific measures, etc. What opportunities, if you can touch on as well, and what is the path forward in the context of that response?
Yeah, so I guess first of all, I think the question you raised, Toussant, highlighted one of the most significant challenges that as developmental institutions we have to deal with, whether it's the World Bank, the Caribbean Development Bank, Inter-American, or any other development institution, which is how do we respond massively in some of these situations, and actually even outside of crisis. How do we deploy our developmental resources and meet the needs of the communities we serve, but do it in a way that mitigate the related fiduciary risk? And the reason why I'm saying this is one of the most significant challenges is it's because it's an exercise in equilibrium when it comes to risk management. We have to strike the right balance between the programmatic risk, because if we fail to intervene as decisively as we should or as quickly as we should, that could have pretty significant ramifications in terms of the delivery of our program. So we need to be able to strike the right balance between intervening, deploying the resources as quickly as we can, but also at the same time managing the related fiduciary risk. And where you strike that balance sometimes can be pretty tricky, because if you swing the pendulum too far one way or the other, it could have unintended consequences. I think if you're only focused on program delivery and disbursements without the right fiduciary safeguards, that could have pretty significant ramifications and ultimately actually undermine your ability to mobilize resources and deploy them in the first place. On the flip side of the equation, if you put too much emphasis on the fiduciary risk to the point that actually they become a roadblock to the implementation of the programs, that could have an unintended consequence. I think it's really important, as we always think about these things, about what is the right equilibrium and the right balance between managing programmatic risk and managing fiduciary risk. And I think in that context, certain things are very important. We're not in the business of avoiding risk, we're in the business of managing risk and mitigating it. And I think a number of the things, at least in the context of the World Bank, go towards that proactive risk mitigation before the risks even materialize. A lot of the things that Laura talked about are absolutely applicable also to how we work in this context of deploying our resources in response to COVID-19. Additional things that I would mention in the specific context of the World Bank would include the extensive due diligence measures that we have put in place as part of the COVID response, because we thought it was really important. The ex post review of contracts in some cases, and also the bank being more involved than usual in the procurement process through the bank facilitated procurement, and also the support to countries in their procurement when we felt that actually there might have been some capacity gaps. The other thing I would say is a strict application of the bank's anti-corruption guidelines, and really making sure that despite the emergency, we were still holding all our stakeholders, the borrowers, the contractors, the subcontractors, everyone had to strictly abide by the bank's anti-corruption guidelines. We did not dilute them and we did not waive them. I think that was also an important element of safeguard. And the integrity vice presidency itself is very much involved in working with the business to mitigate the integrity risks up front, and also to share knowledge based on our past experience that hopefully helps our partners design the programs in a way that mitigate risk. And lastly, INT, the Integrity Vice Presidency, is monitoring on a real-time basis the COVID response projects and looking at allegations. I must say that at this point, we are not seeing anything that worries us too much in terms of an unexpected uptick in allegations, but these are certain things that we have to monitor on a real-time basis. I think on the path forward point that you raised, Laura pointed to the need for cooperation. I think that's one of the big learnings in these situations. Issues of fraud and corruption and integrity issues, there is no institution, whether it's the World Bank or any of ours, that can single-handedly tackle it. I think the more we work collaboratively and engage, particularly in areas where we have joint programs or we have parallel funding, that goes a long way. So I think the area of cooperation is, in my view, one where we need to think very much about how we strengthen that going forward. And also, I think shifting the thinking from immediate issue management to long-term resiliency and sustainability. And this applies also to fraud and corruption, which means we have to think about issues around how do we strengthen institutions, how do we promote transparency, build more accountability at the country level. I think these are all areas we need to think through going forward.
Absolutely, well said. And I'm going to borrow that phrase, an exercise in equilibrium, because I think that's one of our greatest challenges, and this has to happen even at the national and regional levels in the region. I mentioned earlier that we cannot afford to defang, denude, and defund our public accountability institutions during the good times and expect that during the bad times they'll be there, during the uncertain times they'll be able to deliver for us. But I think where we can land this is being very careful to ensure that our audience understands that there are so many lessons that can be taken from all of what we said about how we've been able to think about the need to promote good governance in uncertain times. As we transition our way, as the region transitions its way through the 4 stages of being able to achieve stability, achieve recovery, return to growth, and then sustainable and resilient development, I think it's important for us to understand that we need to have conversations like these, discourses like these, with our global counterparts, because we all stand on the same platform of the need to emphasize that good governance, not only in our funding that we provide, but also generally, will enable us to make that transition safely and successfully. Otherwise, during the good times, we'll be sowing the seeds for the crisis. Without good governance, we'll be sowing seeds for the next crisis. And the funny thing too is that when it comes to good governance in uncertain times, lenders and funders and all of those taxpayers who commit their public funds to efforts like COVID-19 responses want to ensure that the entities to which they commit those funds are sure-footed and that they're not wrong-footed by corruption. And in this context, I'd like to also ensure that we understand, as Mouhammadou mentioned, that there are many opportunities through this crisis, and as Laura emphasized as well, for examples to be obtained from how from not only our work, and in the case of CDB, we're also monitoring carefully. We put a lot of emphasis on due diligence, try to give us the intelligence that we need to be able to know whether our funds are being safely deployed, but to look for examples of good practices, and there are many the world over. And even though we could go on and on about this, time does not permit, but I just wanted to emphasize that there's a need, for instance, to ensure that we promote transparency and better access to information, that we leverage technology and data. We look at illicit financial flows, as Laura mentioned earlier, and how money laundering impacts and expands that risk. Recovery of stolen assets, which is a huge deal for the World Bank as well. Mouhammadou mentioned earlier about the multifaceted approach. I think that is very important. Emphasizing too that the way that the role of facilitators in the whole process of expanding the risk footprint as it relates to managing COVID-19 and other types of risks. And at the more global level, the political will to be able to promote the good governance initiatives that we've spoken about and that we know are needed. What I'd like to do is just ask each of you to give your closing thoughts on the theme and in particular the title of this session. Please go ahead, Laura.
Well, thank you very much, Toussant, and thank you again for the invitation. I think that what a closing thought would be is that we need to view this situation with optimism. And you talked about opportunities. I think we need to realize that the opportunities are born from crises. And there are many opportunities that have been taken advantage of already. For example, citizens are more engaged and are demanding greater accountability, and that's very positive. We have seen that governments are investing in modernizing and digitizing their public financial management systems. Another opportunity is that strong audit and oversight practices can be developed and create a virtuous circle. So we need to also look at the 360-degree approach to integrity, which emphasizes prevention and risk mitigation at the front end, but then also has adequate enforcement mechanisms if prohibited practices or other misconduct do occur. And the final point that I would like to make in looking at the path forward is that good governance and solid integrity risk management systems need to be embedded in the institutional framework of both the public and the private sector. And this will require collective action of all of us. We are all in this together, rowing in the same boat towards a more transparent horizon. And this is something that we need to continue these joint efforts. So thank you very much for starting it with this conference, or continuing it, I should say. And I look forward to future efforts in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. And you, Mouhammadou.
Yeah, very much I would like to echo what Laura said, and once again reiterate my sincere thanks for giving us again the opportunity to join the conference and have this very timely discussion. And agree with all the points that have just been made. And again, I think the two main points I just want to reemphasize. One is we don't know what the next pandemic will be. We don't know what the next crisis will be. But one thing we do know with certainty is that one is coming. When, we don't know, where and in what form, we shall see. But the reality is we need to start increasingly thinking about how do we lay the groundwork and the foundations from all standpoints to make sure that we are in a much better position to deal with these situations. And that also applies to how we manage integrity risks. I think it would be a shame if we don't learn lessons from these crises, both what goes extremely well, but also what goes wrong, and what lessons we can extract that will help us build more resilient systems of integrity, better safeguards that will allow us to manage future crises better, and also a more sustainable recovery. The second aspect is exactly that element that Laura pointed out about no institution can tackle this thing individually, no matter how many resources you put to it or how much convening power you have. This has to be a concerted effort across all of our organizations. But I would say beyond our organizations, across all stakeholder groups, that includes the public sector, that includes the private sector, that includes civil society, the media, academia, and I'm really glad that all of those sectors are actually represented in a forum like this conference, because it will be important that we think through how we design more sustainable systems and safeguards going forward. And I think each of these constituencies has a critical role to play. So let me stop there, but once again, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Great. Thank you both for joining us today in this conference, this groundbreaking conference, as I should say, because I think it does for the region. What it really does for the region, enable us to have a forum, a free, public, open forum, where we can discuss these issues that we often think about that are so critical to us being able to move forward as a region. What you've heard today, audience, is that we've emphasized that good governance can be maintained during times of uncertainty. Good governance and public integrity are pillars of being able to recover and being able to achieve the transition from crisis to recovery and through to sustainable, resilient economic development. I'd like to thank you for joining us. I'd like to thank Mouhammadou and Laura again, and I wish you all the best for the rest of the conference. Do enjoy.
Thank you.
Thank you.